Hey, hello everybody. I'm here with Keelan today, who has an interesting YouTube channel that I recommend you all check out, Formscapes. I wasn't aware of this channel until about a week ago, and that's what I've been doing over the last week is watching these videos. Exceptional stuff. He talks about Morphic Resonance, which I've also talked about. He talks about Whitehead, Electric Universe, and a bunch of very interesting stuff. So would you mind just kind of introducing how you got into these ideas? What was your idea in creating the YouTube channel?
Yeah, it is a very long story if I was going to tell the whole thing because I've been into philosophy for a very long time. I began reading a bit of like Plato and Marcus Aurelius and Aristotle when I was like 15 years old, and it's been a really long journey since then. I've gone through many different phases of different let's say, different fields of philosophy. So I was very into kind of analytic philosophy of mind for quite a while when I was much younger, in my like late teens. I got more into a kind of vaguely post-structuralist sort of thing in my early 20s. So I was reading like Wittgenstein and Foucault and so on and so forth. And really my current interest in philosophy came to take shape really just over the past 5 years or so. I started to branch out into much more what you would probably describe as more esoteric territory, much more explicitly metaphysical realist type territory. And just really started straying much more from the beaten path in a lot of ways. And um, as for the YouTube channel, that just kind of came about due to really a bunch of circumstantial life events. It is something that I've been talking about doing for well over a year before I actually started the channel, but things kind of just came together in my personal life in such a way that I kind of felt like, well, it's now or never. Let's do it. Um, and so I started working on that, and I was like, well, I'm just going to put as much effort as I can into this, and I'm probably going to be appealing to a very niche audience, but whatever. I'm going to do what I can, and it looks like things have been a lot more successful than I originally anticipated, which is pretty great. And I'm just going to keep doing it until I can't anymore. So
Yeah, well, great. Glad to hear that. Yeah, his channel has really taken off quickly, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Today, I'd like to kind of get into uh, your general philosophy as well as some points of possible disagreement might be interesting. But to start with, one topic that you've looked at that I've vaguely been aware of is the electric universe hypothesis, and there are
mhm.
different variants of that. That's one part of your channel's content that I personally have not gotten to yet. So, would you mind just kind of giving the basic kind of layout? What is electric universe? What does it seek to explain? What is the advantage it has over more conventional theories of space time?
Yeah, so electric universe theory is really something that I've been delving into fairly recently, actually, like really just over the past 6 months did it kind of come into my field of awareness. But I took interest in it because it seemed to be a rather genuine and serious attempt to actually reframe our cosmological discussions in a way that to me seemed to be at least inching in the right direction, because it seems to be using the idea of electromagnetism as almost kind of a segue towards looking at cosmic evolution and the evolution of astrophysical phenomenon in a more kind of morphogenetic organismic sort of way rather than the standard gravitational cosmology, which obviously has a great many holes that scientists have been repeatedly unable to fill. Now, as you mentioned, there's many different thinkers who've contributed to the electric universe, and there's a lot of divergence among them. Wall Thornhill, for example, he has this electric dipole model of gravity in which he basically tries to reduce gravity to a kind of electromagnetic phenomenon. I don't find it particularly convincing, to be completely honest. But it's interesting nonetheless. There are lots of things like that, different things about how to interpret how things like comets behave, how galaxies form, how stars work. I mean, it really is a completely different paradigm than that of standard mainstream astrophysical cosmology. And I find it very interesting for that reason. Again, there's a lot of specific claims made within that theory that I'm not really qualified to weigh in on as far as their plausibility or veracity. I am not a physicist, but nevertheless, it's something that I've wanted to talk about because it seems to be intimating a more organismic way of looking at the world beyond our solar system.
Right. Yeah, I've been fascinated by the idea that perhaps, stars are connected in some kind of greater network and that
Mhm.
galaxies aren't like purely a result of mechanistic processes and gravity. They just so happen to form in this way, but maybe the shape of galaxies, the network that a galaxy forms has some function. The hole that you mentioned, I mean, the big one is that we had to posit dark matter, these other kind of exotic, unobservable things in order to explain the way the universe actually looks versus the way it should look in our theories. And I think that's exactly the point that drew me into your channel is this organismic conception of the cosmos. So, Electric Universe is definitely my weakest spot in the things that you've talked about. But I'm interested in the convergence of morphic resonance, bioelectricity. I've also looked at the work of Michael Levin, which he does
Yeah.
have a channel on YouTube, biologist out of Tufts University. He worked with the xenobots, so taking like frog skin cells and giving them essentially autonomy, where they begin solving novel problems. He's done some of the most cutting edge work in synthetic biology, artificial life, essentially. He has intentions of creating AI systems using living components. So, really out there, like the kind of science you imagine that science is when you're in middle school, he's out there doing it, and I bet he's going to get a Nobel Prize for it. But like his way of looking at biology is compatible with morphic resonance. It's also compatible with Platonism. Another big influence I already mentioned, Alfred North Whitehead. I've looked a little bit into Whitehead's philosophy. Um, but yeah, how do you see these different trends all converging? To me, it reminds me of like, the Kuhnian idea of the paradigm. It seems like multiple theoretical frameworks are emerging that could work well together and would, if combined, supplant the existing kind of reductionist, materialist account of the world that most people take for granted. So, how does that like grand synthesis come together for you? Is there like one kind of leading thought in that?
Yeah, yeah. So as I see it, really the most thorough articulation of the transformations that are happening right now is what we find in Whitehead. And the reason for that is because Whitehead is really in every way he is building upon the Neoplatonic tradition. He's very explicit about this. I mean, if anybody's heard a quote by Whitehead, it's probably that all of Western philosophy can be understood as footnotes to Plato. And within the context of that statement, what he's saying is essentially that anything within the Western tradition that's worth being called philosophy builds upon that Platonic foundation, and so that is what he is trying to do as well. But he's not just rephrasing Plato; he is making some pretty drastic transformations. And as I see it, the core of the differences between the kind of Whiteheadian Neoplatonic metaphysics and the more classical Platonic metaphysics is the way that time is understood, and particularly the relationship between the eternal and the temporal. Um, Now, we could look at this really in terms of the way that the ancients saw something like fate, for example. So they saw the imminent material sensory realm as being kind of dictated by a transcendental realm which was beyond. Now, that means there really wasn't an idea of freedom there within the classical philosophy, not exactly the way that we would think of it anyway. The temporal realm was seen to be this kind of cyclical recurrence. I believe that Plato he describes it. The world is like a moving image of eternity, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist. You've got this relationship between the eternal, which is understood to be ontologically real in itself, independently of the world, and then a world which is dependent on the eternal. And so one is dictated by the other. And so everything is understood in terms of fate. Now, within Whitehead's metaphysics, the understanding of time changes dramatically. And this is really the thread that ties in Whitehead's work also with that of, I would say, the German idealist movement, and also with Jean Gebser's work with the idea of integral consciousness, which then kind of brings us into Ken Wilber territory, even though I have some very big disagreements with Ken Wilber, but nonetheless, this idea of time and the idea of time freedom, I think, is very central, because what happens here as we start to think of time as a concretion or concrescence of possibilities through this kind of organismic creative process, creative cosmogony, then that relationship between the atemporal or the anachronistic and the chronological world, the temporal sensory domain, changes in many ways. It starts to appear that the formative aspects of beings, of organisms, or any things in the world are as much within things as they are beyond them. And so there's this kind of opening up of the possibility of understanding the world in terms of the activity of a creative freedom, rather than just being a mirroring of an eternal order, let's say.
Okay, right. So on the topic of fate, I would always recommend Proclus's essay, Fate, Providence, and That Which Is Within Our Power, which deals with this question of free will. I would say they had a concept of freedom, but typically for that kind of classical Neoplatonic view, freedom essentially consists in removing oneself from the world of generation and returning to the forms. We have freedom in our knowledge. We don't have freedom in our choice. Um, I'm sure you see the focus issue on your camera.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
working on it.
we'll deal with that. So there are two different concepts of fate and necessity. The higher is necessity, ananke, which regulates even the nature of the forms. That's like a metaphysical necessity that can't be avoided. And I actually do intuitively feel that something like that has to be present. You know, like Chris Langan talks about the way in which this unbounded will essentially forms itself into a coherent cosmos, mutualistically, but also guided by this kind of highest teleological force. And that kind of computes for the greatest good overall, computing for utility essentially. But imagine running that like an infinite number of times. You're defining a phase space that is characterized by laws. And so those laws I would think of as this kind of ananke or necessity that governs how form could in principle arise. So you need some kind of necessity, even if the particular formal principles that instantiate in a particular universe slant one way or another. it seems like the dynamics by which that process occurs have to be based on certain, for lack of a better term, axioms that, if you spell out their entailments, contain all of their possible implications. So that's the necessity aspect. Fate, hymarmene, is a lower thing and really has to do with the way in which events in the physical world are coordinated. So we don't have choice in the physical world in the same way that, like, even a philosopher who believes in free will? Hardly anyone does. A lot of Christian philosophers, think of uh, free will as the ability to like choose between alternatives, but that choice is seen as basically deterministic. We're always going to go for what we're drawn to the most. But what gives us freedom is the volitional aspect above mere choice, where we actually are engaged in constructing our values, because nature doesn't fully disclose the intrinsic value of all things. We have to like do that work of finding out what is valuable, and it's in that combination of exercising our will and improving our knowledge that we basically create a feedback cycle, similar to what John Vervaeke calls relevance realization, I think. And
Mhm.
that's where that true freedom might consist. And Proclus talks about a similar idea in that essay that I referenced. But going back to the kind of higher necessity ananke, do you get where I'm coming from with that intuition that even if like things do mutually shape each other in an organismic way, in fact, in the world, like beyond that, isn't there that kind of phase space of the ways in which that could have come about? Like you get the intuition of there has to be a higher necessity at work.
Yeah, so there's several layers to this I think we could talk about. So let's begin with the necessity thing. Yeah, there is, I think, always going to be certain, um, let's say, patterns, archetypal motifs, let's say, that are going to be there, maybe even just simply due to the a priori nature of mathematics, the a priori nature of the different ways that organic creativity can unfold within a three-dimensional space and time and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, you're going to have certainly a necessity in that sense. Though I don't think that would be quite the same as um, and you did make that distinction between necessity and fate. That kind of necessity is, it seems to me, much more like a kind of toolkit of possible forms, as it were. It's the anachronon, the Platonic heaven, if you want to call it that. But then, um, once we kind of look at how that becomes instantiated, how actual habits and consistencies develop in nature, I think you do have to take into account the kind of creative agency that you see, not just in human beings, but in organic processes in general. Because as Whitehead sees it, he kind of understands organisms as being dipolar. So there's kind of two halves to them, basically, and they're two sides of the same coin. But on the one side, you have the corporeal, the inheritance of the past, the continuity of like one's own body, for example, right? And then you have the ingression of possibilities drawn from what we could call a phase space, possibility space, morphogenetic field, whatever you want to call that. And so there's always within that kind of field, that aura, if you will, a kind of diffuse distribution of possible things that I could do with my hands, or words that I could say, or places the electron could be when it's detected, that kind of thing. So there's always an indeterminacy there that's always going to be collapsing down into definite bodily realities, actualities, which can then serve as kind of the foundation for the continual recreation of the universe. Um, But that kind of, I would call that agency. You could call it freedom in a sense, and that it is a kind of self-determinacy from indeterminacy. But when we're talking about human freedom, the way that you mentioned, that is a bit more complicated, I think, because freedom for human beings is it's more than just indeterminacy. It's more than just self-determinacy. It's really a capacity, I would say, to limit oneself in accordance with the what one experiences as the highest ideals, the logos, the driving tellers of reality. You see this. I think this is made very clear in like Dostoevsky's novels, and maybe Tolstoy as well. This that freedom is not having options and choosing between them. Freedom is a moral compulsion, really, for human beings. It's like if you think of the universe as maybe a kind of tape that you could replay over and over again. And let's say you're in a scenario where like a person is drowning and you have the option to save them or not. And you replay that scenario over and over and over again. And half the time you save them and half the time you don't. Is that really freedom? It's indeterminacy, certainly, but real freedom there, I think, would actually be in the case where it feels more determinate, where you save them every single time because of that moral imperative, right? Because then that is more of a self-determination. If it's different every single time, then that actually kind of implies that it's random contingent factors which are causing it to go one way or the other, not that moral core which we ideally should be identifying with as the locus of our selfhood.
That's like a Kantian definition of autonomy, essentially. Like free action has to be according to some principle that you're willing. And since the principles that we will ought to be universalized also for Kant, then yeah, what you're describing is a very kind of Kantian picture of ethics. It's counterintuitive because when we think of freedom, we think of the options that we have available, our ability to choose. Um, so, about setting down those principles, though, and what we're kind of at core committed to, do you see that as being subject to this same kind of like gradual creative energy? Are those principles in that sense? I don't want to call them arbitrary because agents, under this hypothesis that creative energy makes the forms rather than like the forms are there, they determine us, we're not determined by them, but like we have a co-originating role with them.
Right.
Supposing that, um, is it like wholly arbitrary or wholly a product of our acts of valuation that those principles emerge? Because my view would be more that no, the forms are up there, they're always going to be up there. Truth, beauty, goodness is never going to change. I just have to like reach up and participate of it, and there it is. That's my principle. So, what about
Yeah,
those
no, I completely
principles?
agree with that. When it comes to the inner telos that I believe generates reality itself, the logos, that I would say is necessitated by the very possibility of a reality. So it's kind of like what Chris Longan would call the super tautological nature of the world. There's something kind of self necessitating about that very possibility. And so no, we're not just like making up moral values. That if we're really talking about morality and not just, for example, like social norms or priorities or something like that, then we are talking about, I would say, whether or not our beliefs and actions and norms and whatnot actually accord with that logos. And I think the best expression that we find of what that logos is in the story of Christ. It's all right there. You have the embodiment of the cosmic ultimate universal within, kind of reflected within the particularity of an individual human life, the interiority of human life experience, and then that is lived and then kind of sacrificed, contributed to the furthering of this creative process as it moves forward. And that necessitation, I believe, is really what is the underlying determining factor for the evolutionary trajectory of our cosmos as a whole, and particularly the coming about of biological life and ultimately human life on this planet. And wherever we're going from here, it's all going to be kind of bending, as it were, around a kind of spiral towards the intensification of that realization, I would say.
Right. So like a Chardinian, Taylor de Chardin conception of evolution, which is interesting. So in that vein, the universe has freedom, but to exercise that freedom optimally, it ought to kind of reach beyond itself into the transcendent to bring down these guiding principles. Does that mean that this like cyclone process leading us to a higher state of being is always inevitably going to converge on one ideal kind of utopian eschaton state? Is that implicit in what you're saying?
I don't know. I really don't. This is something where in in imagining what the kind of end goal of this process could look like, I've always found myself imagining this just kind of like cosmic cathedral like super organism. I mean, that seems to be what Chardin was describing. Just everything somehow kind of gets woven together into this one cosmic super consciousness. I don't know if you're familiar with oh, I'm gonna mispronounce this. I know I am. Galahad Eridanus. No,
Mm-mm. Nope.
he's a YouTuber. He's talked about kind of similar things that I have, and he discussed these spiritual experiences he had in which he experienced something similar to that, like kind of visually saw. I believe he called it a solar temple, which I think is very interesting because it was very much like what I had in mind while thinking about Chardin's work. And then in what he described, he said that like at the center of that, there was this kind of star or sun type thing, but then there was this like seraphim type being in the center of that, which then kind of like calls back to the book of Elijah, right, with the seraphim, the six-winged angelic being, anyway. And so all of that kind of like intimates maybe this idea that there is some kind of ultimate cosmic destiny that's pulling everything forward, which is a very profound thought. It's very interesting at the very least. But that does kind of leave open the question is, how necessitated is that? I mean, could you have a different universe with a different kind of like omega, a different kind of ultimate attractor at the end of time? I don't see why not. But it's very difficult to imagine exactly what that might look like in a world that has very different ground conditions. Let's say maybe you could have a universe with a different number of spatial dimensions or something like that, or different archetypes are at play somehow. But then again, there's also this part of me that thinks, I don't know about that, because I feel like the composition of our universe in a lot of ways is, as you suggested, necessitated. It's not really possible for us to, well, maybe it's not impossible, but it's kind of difficult for us to imagine a universe in which like the rules of geometry were like completely different, right? That really does seem to be something that's kind of baked into the eternal cake, as it were. So how much variability is there within that, really? Maybe we're just spiraling into that omega point over and over and over again in different ways. I'm not sure.
Right. On that, what is your philosophy of mathematics? I mean, it sounds like essentially you think mathematicals are discovered and they all exist eternally no matter what. or can we?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm a realist about mathematics. I'm a realist about forms, about archetypes, all that.
Mhm.
I'm pretty much diehard Platonist when all said and done. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of Max Tegmark's concept of the mathematical universe?
All right. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Tegmark, the way that he's going about this is it's interesting because sometimes he's described as kind of a Platonist. I really don't see it that way because what he's doing is this. He's saying that he thinks there's something suspicious, let's say, about the idea that mathematical entities have a certain kind of existence and then the world has a certain kind of existence. Why do we need two different kinds of existence? Why can't we just have one flat ontology? And if that's the case, then maybe you could think of really our universe as just one kind of mathematical object within this infinitely expansive range of mathematical objects. So so that would basically be to say that every single um, mathematical structure which could possibly generate a universe is a universe because there's no distinction there. There's no actualization of the potential within Tegmark's philosophy. So that doesn't really work for me because even if you try to flatten things out in that way, you still kind of end up with this thing where you have to be making a distinction between real potentialities and then imminent actualities just to make sense of the fact that time exists, unless you're going to go the route of just saying that time is an illusion and then it's a completely perspectival phenomenon, like which is basically what Einstein does. But yeah, I just don't think that works. Whitehead and Henri Bergson both rejected that for pretty much the exact same reasons. They said no, that is basically just denying the experiential foundations of the very possibility of us even understanding the world that we're in. It's just kind of like sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. And therefore, that's just really not an acceptable conclusion. I think they're right about that. It detaches us so far from the concreteness of the actual world we find ourselves in that I don't think that really works. And moreover, it leaves a lot of things unexplained. I think that a more realist, more teleological explanation of the universe can actually accord with. So for example, if Tegmark's right, then that means that there's presumably an infinite or impossibly vast or unimaginably vast number of universes that are more or less like ours, but maybe slightly different because you change some variables here and there. But that would also probably imply that there could be just as many universes which consist of nothing but writhing Lovecraftian chaos and a single Boltzmann brain. Okay, so there's an infinite number of those Boltzmann brains out there in those mathematically structured universes, and just as many universes like this. Why do we find ourselves in one of these? It seems just as likely, if not more likely, that we would find ourselves in a universe that was mostly just entropic chaos than we would find ourselves in one that actually is comprehensible and makes sense. And yet we do find ourselves in a universe that is comprehensible and makes sense. There's plenty of room for chaos in mathematics. I don't really see a lot of chaos in the universe. I see indeterminacy. I see fluctuations. I don't see meaninglessness. I don't see any just nonsensical stuff that just happens to be there because some variables are tweaked in a slightly different way. So
Hmm. Yeah,
that's basically my take on Techmark.
I
Yeah.
understand that objection.
Mm-hmm.
The objection about the intelligibility of the world necessitating temporal A theory, which is what I think you were saying essentially. That I don't understand yet, but I'll ask you more about that. I think for Tegmark, for his philosophy to make sense, we just have to bring it back to the Platonic foundations. It's good that he's interested in integrated information theory because I think that's
Yeah.
the key to make this work. In Neoplatonism, all grades of being move from the fewer and more complete to the manifold and less complete, to the point where, like within the mathematicals, we have a distinction between real mathematicals and then shadows of mathematicals. That's why like it's possible to have false math, because there's the shadows of mathematicals. They have to have a subsistence. Plato deals with that problem in the Sophist, like the reality of false things. Like, how can we talk about things that are not true if they don't have some kind of subsistence? But
Mm.
anyway, that invokes this idea that like some mathematicals are realer than others. So for a universe to subsist, I think this is my opinion, has to be an integrated information system. Because otherwise, what gives it that cohesiveness that we identify when we call it a universe? I think souls also have to be integrated because we have to define ourselves. We're autopoietic in the modern sense, the Varelian sense, but also we're self causing in the Neoplatonic sense, in that our essence it like self contains. We are that which defines ourself into being. We're dependent on higher forms, but a soul, because souls reflect all other souls, is sort of the sum of that third hypostasis itself. It stands independently because it contains all the principles that it needs for its own self definition. It's not like a partial thing. In another sense, like individual souls are more partial than the world soul, but we have that kind of fractal, I'm reflecting everything else, including the world soul. So all the ingredients are there in me. That's why they
Right.
think,
And so within that kind of monadic nature of the soul, you again, it's this kind of fractal reiteration of those universal principles. The self-generating nature of reality is also what we see in the soul, and which is
mhm,
why I was asked. Somebody asked me about this recently, like, why would you have a universe in which there's um, so much tumultuousness and suffering and uncertainty and whatnot, if this is all really being guided in some kind of teleological way, then why not just start at the end point? And I think the reason for that is really that our universe, there's a necessitating of freedom there. It's not just about creating a kind of bliss or something. Bliss is kind of like your ground state, like your Brahman consciousness, just pure oneness.
Sachidananda. Yeah.
Right. But that's not what's trying to be achieved. That's like the baseline. What's trying to be achieved is something more like, I would say, like an intensification of beauty or numinosity or something like that, which necessitates uncertainty. It necessitates pain. It
Hmm.
requires a kind of agony to it. I was once speaking to a an Eastern Orthodox priest about some of these topics, and he was talking about this kind of spiritual experience he had. He was originally a philosophy professor, and then he went on to become a priest. And he said that in that moment of like spiritual ecstasy or whatever, which occurred to him, he said it was a a state of peace in between ultimate agony and ultimate bliss. And that way of describing it has always just really stuck with me, because that really calls to, I think, the really the whole teleology of this whole thing, of our whole universe, is somehow aimed at that somehow.
Mm. Yeah, I think it ties back into that same problem of non being from the sophist and
Mhm.
the Platonic explanation or solution to the problem of evil, which you've referenced. So going back to like correcting Tegmark for just a
Mm.
moment, I think on the one hand, he needs the distinction between the real mathematicals and then the kind of shadows of mathematicals. So you can't just have like 2 plus 2 equals 4 being a universe of its own somewhere. It's not self defining. More is necessary. So you need these souls essentially. Iamblichus identified the nature of the soul with the nature of the mathematicals and with music and also with choice. And somehow these three things, music, mathematics, and choice, are all integral.
Mhm.
Which I think makes sense if mathematics are necessary to aspectualize the forms. The forms contain unlimited possibility, and there's inevitably going to be choice in the mode of their expression. So you have to have that choice, and mathematics always involves some choice. You have to set down your equation in a particular way. It's not as
Mhm.
deterministic as we think. But
Yeah,
then
and so
beneath,
go ahead.
okay,
Sorry.
just the next part of it is I think he's also missing the Platonic concept of matter. So once we have these integrated information systems, these souls, they exist with respect to a kind of cloud of probability of what they might do, including all of the error in a cosmos. And so, in a sense, I agree with Tegmark in that the mathematicals are the real formal principles in nature, and so they are what is real. But even though matter is seen as privatory, it is the absence of form, it is kind of pure potential, nevertheless, like functionally, it exists. Maybe matter in itself as a principle doesn't exist for Neoplatonists, but clearly the effects of matter exist. And I think Tegmark hasn't yet identified that function of matter. And I think that's actually a big problem, and I think it's probably what you're attracted to in Whitehead and Sheldrake and this like realm of the possible. The how exactly does that function? Because I don't think modern science deals with that well.
Yeah, so what you mentioned about the kind of indeterminacy of form itself, that's really interesting, right? Because um, the traditional way of understanding this is that the formal realm, the forms, are that which necessitates, that which fates, that which determines. And then matter or the primary substance is this kind of formlessness, this kind of clay, which is then shaped in a certain way. And that makes sense. But at the same time, you can also kind of flip it. You can also say that like the form of a triangle, let's say like a right triangle or whatever, that's something that can be instantiated in an endless number of different ways. And so there's this not yet determinedness to forms in themselves, and it is actually their actualization, their becoming embodied, which then um, determines, solidifies certain relational aspects. So if I think of like the triangular shape of the little needle thing on a sundial, for example. So now that's something much more concrete. That's something where that particular form is entering into a determinate relationship with all these other forms that are in the universe. And so matter, if we try to understand matter as this kind of stuff that's, again, if we think of it as a kind of clay, I mean, that metaphor can work, but it only kind of goes so far, because really I think what matter is, what the corporeal realm is, it's the past. That's really what it is. It's that which has already happened, that the present is then building upon to realize more past, to build more universe on top of it. So you and I do think you don't need something like what the Greek atomists believed in, right? Like the universe is made out of these little BBs. You don't have little BBs. There aren't any. We have fields and we have electro subatomic events, these actions, which is really what they are. There are no self subsistent objects, physical objects that we could call photons or electrons. They're actions. They are and Whitehead, I think this is something that he understands very well. He sees that it's that what we think of as matter in the sense of enduring physical objects are not the ground state of corporeal ontology. They're actually a later development. You need events first, and then you can start kind of tying those events up in these kind of cyclical knots, and then you get things that start to behave like enduring physical objects that subsist over time.
Right. Or in information reductionalism, things reduced to not individual atomic entities, but distinctions. The essence of a bit is it distinguishes one state from another state. So there's something relational at the fundamental level something that is in a particular event as well. Um, and I think this is also related to the distinction between classical information and quantum information. So, classical information specifies concrete states, quantum information specifies probability distributions. And they have a trade off. So, as you gain more classical information, you lose out on quantum information. If you reduce the classical information, you increase the quantum information. But I think neither of those quite get to like the Platonic idea of matter, which would be like the limiting case on maximum, in a way, maximum quantum information, where all possibility is contained together without differentiation. Possibility as we encounter it here is always shaped. You know, there are particular curves that define possible actions for electrons. It's not totally unbounded. Their possibility is structured. But if in the limit of that, when the least classical information is specified, the least distinctions and relations are specified, then the field of possibility is basically isomorphic with that Brahman consciousness. As you put it, it's like the mirror side of it, where the bliss consciousness would be everything in pure act. The pure matter would be like the inverse, where it's pure potentiality, unstructured by anything. I think that concept is important. And again, it's related to that, like, you need the lie in order to fill out the class of beings that incorporate the truth. In many occasions in the dialogues, Socrates will say that in order to know how to do something well, you have to be the person who can do it the worst, right? To be the best mathematician, you have to be able to give wrong answers if you want to. The bad mathematician might accidentally give a good answer. So the person that is capable of doing the worst in math is the person who knows math the best. So in order to kind of explore our own essence, which I think is a return to those more necessary principles, a return to the nature of soul, away from the nature of matter, towards form, away from formlessness. In order to do that fully, to really know ourselves at that level, we have to periodically go through the descent away from what we know into forgetfulness so that we relearn all of the possible errors that clarify what is true. So I think that's that teleological function, why we have to go through this. Because if we didn't, then the omniscient God that's just sitting in, perfect goodness all the time, like the thought might occur to him, like, what if I had sinned? And then that's some piece of knowledge. Obviously, the knowledge of like a sinful life is inferior to the knowledge of the sinless life. But if you don't have that knowledge, then you don't have omniscience. So another way of putting it is like, if we just had the forms sitting there and no instantiations of the forms, they would sort of be groundless. Like, theoretically, we can say they ground themselves, they're eternal objects, they don't need a cause. But if you incorporate the idea that, like, computational entities, like beings that have to make choices and calculate all of the mathematical consequences of the forms, who have to ascend to the forms and come to know them through this wide variety of experience, like, the collection of all the beings that do that kind of substantiate the form. They give a grounds to what are the contents of the forms. Exactly like what the forms are, I think, is hard to pin down in Plato. But from the Neoplatonists, we have that they reflect each other in signature ways. So all the forms contain all the other forms, but in a particular kind of spectral analysis, where like the strengths or the relative potencies of all of these formative principles are in it in a signature fashion. But then also, everything that causes causally contains its effects. And so in order for the form to be what it is, truly, it has to pre-contain everything that it might do. In the Sophist, Plato says that the definition of a being is it either causes something to happen or is affected by something. So causal powers are equated with existence for Plato. And so what are the causal powers of the forms? What is their true existence? It's their myriad instantiations. Mm-hmm. So we need all of those for the forms to be what they are. Like we have to be here. That's kind of the way that I think about
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it because if you're thinking of forms as potentialities, so discrete potentialities as opposed to the imminent potentiality of formlessness, then I mean, if you have a potentiality that can't do anything, that can't participate in a world, it's not really a potentiality. Like the very idea of potentiality necessitates the possibility of participation. So, but to harken back to what you were saying about that idea of like God dreaming of like, just kind of imagining what like our lives would be, for example, you could say that maybe like if you looked at the possibility of just God as such, no universe, you've just got the ultimate oneness, pure awareness of all possibility or whatever. Um, I think that the thing that's missing there that really sets this in motion is the role of experience, because if you got all possibilities just kind of felt at the same time in the same way, there's a lack of differentiation, which means there's a lack of intensity, right? And it's that intensity, I think, that is very central here. I think this is something you see in Whitehead and in Deleuze, actually, though Deleuze is, I think, much less of a Platonist than myself or you or Whitehead, but either way, I think he's right about emphasizing that idea, because what happens is whenever you have agency, whenever you have decision making within these moments of worldly corporeal actuality, there's always a kind of sacrifice that's happening. You're taking a range of possible futures, possible universes, really, and you're, putting the vast majority of them on the chopping block in favor of whatever decision is actually made, whatever universe comes to actually be actualized, right? And so there's a valuation in that. And so the universe that actually comes to be generated through that process is a very small sliver of all possible worlds, as it were. And so you could say that maybe in a sense all those other possible worlds are still kind of present within the mind of God or whatever, but the actual world, that's the one that is kind of like lit up. That's the one that is experienced in this much more intense manner, I think. And that's really what's driving this. It's not just a will to contemplate beauty. It's a will to embody beauty, to embody numinosity, to find that extreme of intensity in between agony and bliss. That's why we're here. I think that's why any of us is here.
Yeah. I think the possible universes are out there, though. There are just a lot of failed possible universes. Universes that get started and pick the wrong laws of physics and they just collapse into a giant black hole and nothing happens. And so then it tries again, and only a small number of them go all the way to that kind of Chardin funnel up to like the omega point, something like that.
It could be. It could also be that if there's this kind of feeling forward that happens at the beginning of the universe, that you could have something where, things start to expand out and then, things aren't quite right. And so they collapse back down, but then things get fiddled in a certain way. And so it could be this thing where the early universe was just this kind of boiling cauldron of these various differentiated actions trying to like discover the patterns that can allow for the self-subsistence of um, organic beings, basically. Organic in the much broader sense, things like atoms, stars, and whatnot. Biological life forms obviously are a much later development, but just for the very possibility of like self-generative, self-perpetuating forms, I think
Right.
that would be the goal that would be striving toward. But it could be like that. It could be just like you have a kind of multiverse where these are kind of blinking into existence and most of them just collapse into nothing. Um,
Right.
it's kind of the same thing either way, though. In a sense, it just depends on how you look at it, I think.
Right. Well, to differentiate them, you'd have to differentiate between the real existence of potential and the real existence of actual beings. And that is pretty tough because, like, again, for the omniscient God, he knows every detail of the potential reality with perfection. And I would think that if you have perfect knowledge of something exhaustively, you're not missing anything that's there in the actual universe that's not there in the potential universe, you know? So I have tended to think of actuality and potentiality in more like, the way David Lewis does with his counterfactual realism. Actuality is anthropic. We perceive what is actual because that's where we are. It'd be like,
Mhm.
you're somewhere on the map and you look around you. It's like, wow, I am here. I'm in the one special place that is the here. But like, no, all the places are here for anything that's there. Just like anything that's potential for us is actual for whatever is substantiating that reality in itself. Because otherwise, you need this kind of phantom reality for whatever is over there occupying that potentiality. We need it to exist for logical reasons, but then if you want to say it's fundamentally distinct from what is actual, I just think it'd be hard to disambiguate that from the alternative where what is actual for you is what you are, what is present for you, and what is potential for you is what is, not present for you. So why I've heard a lot of people go for this idea though, and I think it's related to the question of temporal A theory versus B theory. I've never had a problem just imagining that, okay, yeah, the future exists, all possible futures exist. They're not present for me because that's not where I am. Again, in the same way, I'm at one place on the map and it's special for me because I'm there, but it's not ontologically special. So, it seems that Whitehead places like an ontological uniqueness in the present, where there is a real present that flows and a real future that's distinct from present. And I'm usually like, well, why can't it be present for the future beings that are enjoying that state instead?
Yeah, yeah. I think myself and Whitehead are much more ontologically realistic about the distinction between potentiality and actuality than what you're suggesting. And so you could look at it like that. You could look at it from an Einsteinian perspective, or you could kind of quantize the Einsteinian perspective to allow for possible futures instead of just one the way that he saw it. And you could say, and this is really Kantian in a way too. If you're like, well, our experience of time is just because the experience that is contemplating time in this present moment is situated in a particular point in time, and so it looks like there is a discrete past and future. But then you could say that there's not really something there's not really something ontological that distinguishes this actuality from other possible futures. Like the possibilities are actual in the same sense as this is actual, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
From
and I
its frame of reference, like, why not?
and I disagree with that though, and this is also why I disagree with Tegmark, because it what happens then is, first of all, I don't think you really you have to, if you're going to have a discrete timeline of the past, then you've got to somehow have a collapsing down of possible futures into actual corporeal events which constitute the past. There's got to be something that does a selecting there. Now you could look at it in this kind of quantum multiverse kind of way, where it's like, well, it's just dice rolls every step of the way, and we just, whatever experience we're having right now situates us within some kind of possible timeline, but all the possible timelines are equally real. I don't think that really works, for a number of reasons. Part of the reason is I don't think it adequately accounts for the actual nature of our experience in the world. The fact that we do seem to be selecting from possible futures, not just kind of stumbling into them. I guess sometimes it does feel that way, but there is this sense in which every moment is a decision, right? And so from Whitehead's perspective, the way that he sees this, and this kind of harkens back to what I was saying before about Tegmark. You said you didn't really understand what I was saying, so let me try and elaborate that a bit. Whitehead, and you also see this with Henri Bergson and Johann von Goethe, all of them kind of give this critique of the trajectory of science. They see it as becoming increasingly abstract and increasingly divorced from human experience. Whereas the very idea of science, really the very idea of philosophy, is that one can encounter the world, whether it be, with natural science, the actual natural world, or with metaphysics, the metaphysical realm of the forms. Either way, you're coming into contact with reality, which is your own reality that you are a part of. And that's really the foundation of any kind of knowledge, has to begin from that and grow out from it. And if as soon as you kind of start making this Kantian anti-realist move where you're saying, well, our experiences of the world can just be dismissed as a kind of illusion or whatnot, you're sawing off the branch that you're sitting on, really. And so
Well,
Whitehead
let's just stop there quickly. So why do you think that counterfactual realism is dismissing what we are seeing as illusory?
Well, because it makes decision making into an illusion, because you're not really selecting between different possible futures. Then you're just finding yourself in a state with a particular timeline, and then all of those possible futures and possible pasts are equally actual, because you don't have a distinction between actuality and potentiality,
Right. Well,
right?
your identity, if your identity is happenstance, but maybe what you really will is what you are, and what you are defines where you are.
Right. Okay. But then you've kind of got to have a distinction between actuality and potentiality, then, because then there's that willing itself has to be a selecting of possible universes. Right. So I actually think we're almost on the same page, because what you're saying is that which is experienced is that which is willed. Okay, but it's that experientiality, I think, is what distinguishes an actuality from a potentiality, because of the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. And this is exactly what Whitehead would say, I think. But Whitehead, what he's really trying to do here is he's beginning with looking at the structure of our experience. Like he's looking at, like, what is the metaphysical structure of what it is to just be in a world, period. And then he begins from that and builds a cosmology out of it. If you start with, let's say, ideas like the things we see in quantum mechanics or whatever, and I don't want to like cast doubt on quantum mechanics per se, but I'm saying if you're beginning with something like that and then extrapolating from it in such a way that you're being dismissive of the metaphysical structure of the experience of being in a world itself, that's when you're painting yourself into a corner, because you're kind of like climbing up a ladder and then kicking it behind you, as it were.
Yeah, I don't know. I think when I was a kid, before abstracting about this stuff, the idea that the universe is, now of course I was a kid in the 90s where like the multiverse idea was talked about on the Science Channel and stuff, so it's
String
understandable,
theory
but
documentaries on PBS. Yeah.
right. Yeah, so it wasn't that hard to imagine that there was an actual world where I had made an alternative decision. So again, it just like at face value doesn't seem to contradict the nature of experience for me. Also, like if you take this idea, Henry Stapp, American physicist, in a book Quantum Theory and Free Will, talks about how again, to like ground it in quantum mechanics to some extent, the formalism of like von Neumann quantum mechanics involves the idea that the measurement process has to do with a number of queries that take place and refine a result. All of those queries are not in the time of the system, though. So it's a kind of like eternal time in which these questions are asked. To my mind, that is like God asking the hypothetical, like, what would it be like to be formscapes or airvol, you know?
Mhm.
And so if that was, you know, the kind of ground, that identity, just imagine God has the ability to kind of simulate what any particular identity would be like. Once that identity is laid down, the future is open in the sense that there are different possible permutations, combinations, lines you can go down, but they can all still be there in a real sense, in that God simultaneously in eternity is like imagining what it would be like to be all those other points. That's grounding his omniscience. You know, and if I don't have that like lived experience to fill out what it means to be possible, then again the possibility state becomes very ambiguous and fuzzy. Like in a lot of ways I'm an idealist. Like what is real is grounded in what is possible to be experienced. It has to be
Mhm.
real for a subject. Maybe beyond a certain point in our ontology we can like have a non-dual, you know, objectivity slash subjectivity or something. But as far as like physical reality, it seems to require a subject to substantiate. And so what are these possible futures? But I was going to say, I think the same would apply for the past as well. Like the way phenomenologically we deal with the past is not as a determinate timeline. It itself is open. That's why archaeology is interesting. Like we're discovering the past, and I think actually possibly like shaping the past in our process of discovery. Um, so yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah. Okay. So I think so you're wanting the possible and the formative to be real. I don't have a problem with that. There is a reality to the formal, to the indeterminate, to the possible. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is that there needs to be a distinction between that and the actual. So you have real potentialities, you have like not real potentialities, like the possibility of a unicorn appearing in my living room right now
Mm-hmm.
is a non-real possibility that we can gesture towards. So there's the real, which is not yet actual, which actualizes to become the corporeal. And that really is the distinction that's important there, I think, because it is experience, it's consciousness itself, beginning with the consciousness of God, which kind of mediates between those two. It kind of funnels one into the other, I think. Now, what you're saying about the past is interesting. That there could be a kind of superposition of possible timelines leading up to the present. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's a wild idea, um, because if we're looking at it simply from kind of the perspective of like quantum determination, it seems to be necessarily true that there could be an innumerable, a vast number of possible timelines that it could have gotten us to this particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
So my issue with that, though, mm, I'm iffy about this. Let me tell you why I'm iffy about it, but I'm not dead set on how I feel about this. But so if the kind of Bergsonian, Sheldrakean, Whiteheadian understanding of the past that I've advocated for is true, that means that the determinations of the present moment are not just a matter of an immediate prior event, just kind of dominoes knocking one another over. There's a sense in which the entire past is kind of feeding into the present moment over and over again. Now, beginning with that, I would probably want to say something like, well, that means that the actuality of the past is privileged in a way that possible past timelines are not, and that there would need to be a real distinction there. That the if my brain, it's having a recollection, it's regenerating an experience that I had in the past, that past experience is going to be available to this present moment in a way that possible past are not. But at the same time, I don't think that's necessarily incompatible with the possibility that there could be some wiggle room there, that you could have maybe a superposition of past states that we are maybe in some way selecting from. Um, So I don't know. That's a very interesting one. I'm not entirely how you would distinguish between no wiggle room, some wiggle room, and a lot of wiggle room there. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
So we get new past all the time. Like whenever we look at the stars, we're being informed about actual states of the past that were previously undetermined. Like when a
Mm,
supernova happens, that happened, millions of years ago potentially. We see it. It's determinate now as a structure of classical information, right? So we have a classical information structure that is a memory structure, right? I've heard your talk about morphic resonance and memory. That was really good. I highly recommend that series, by the way, on morphic resonance, because I had read Sheldrake's first book and looked at his talks, but yeah, Formscapes gets into some concepts related to morphic resonance that were very thought provoking for me. But anyway, memory is important for Sheldrake. He sees like this resonance of forms as actually substantiating our ability to recover memory. What I'm talking about is more like the way that memory is conceived in computer science, right? It's
mhm.
a physical state of a system that basically narrows down the possible past states that could have produced it. It's like a deterministic enough system where like the fact that the ball is here rather than here tells you something about what must have happened in the past. So that's a structure of classical information. Classical information just being determinate positions in a space-time nexus, essentially, and that structure evolves through time because it's integrated in a Platonic view because it's all organized by one world soul that unites it organically, but just in a like this more computer science, like mechanistic view for now, it's also integrated because things are causally affecting one another in a way that amounts to a kind of like computational memory where the fact that this light from this supernova is hitting us now is narrowing down the states of the past. It is like we're accessing memory that we didn't have before. So that memory state is being defined from the past in things that are very far away and are reaching us. And that's structuring this, like, you could call it a causal set. That's one theory in physics where, and it's related to like the idea in loop quantum gravity where they want to quantize space time, but basically looking at the observable universe, everything we have access to, not as a continuum, but as a discrete set of events, a discrete set of like specified moments that beyond which, not being specified is perhaps open, and that's the open question, and that's where this question would be decided: is do we want to say that beyond our causal set, beyond our observable universe, or it's actually more general than the observable universe? It's what is it, a space-like distance from us in relativity, or what is, I think, like causally inaccessible, causally disconnected in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, when you think of Schrodinger's cat, he's in a superposition in the box because we don't have causal access to him. And so that's like, it's the same question. What is beyond our causal access? What is kind of outside of our causal set? Is that fully specified in the past or future, or is it open? And if you want to say it's fully specified, like at the edge of the observable universe, you take a step past it and it's just more stuff of the same character. Of course, if you actually did go out there, then it would be within your causal set. And of course, it would be deterministic, just like everything else you observe at macroscopic scales is.
So
But
it's like whether or not we are like rendering it as we go, as it were, right?
right, right. And if you want to say that beyond that, everything is already fully determined, 7 billion years ago in some distant region, from our perspective, as far as what has causal relevance to us, it's totally ambiguous. Like our identity as that causal set would be precisely the same. And yet that could be either way. So if you want to say, yes, it is fully specified, then kind of where is that information stored? Because what you're saying is there's a relation between us as we are now and then that place 7 billion years ago. So where is the information about that relation stored? I think that's the extra step, actually. It seems like what I'm suggesting is like less parsimonious to say that like the distant past is not determined. But if you want to say it's determined, something has to make that determination. Like something has to do the work of
Mhm.
specifying the information that characterizes our relations to that thing.
Yeah, there's a number of different things to consider there. One is how central human consciousness is per se. Um, if human consciousness really does play a role in, let's say, like this final phase of collapsing things into determinacy, then it could be that you have, I don't know, maybe a kind of very much more nebulous distribution of actualities, which then kind of funnel into moments of human experience, if human experience is kind of privileged in that way, which it could be. Now, I am kind of coming at this from much more of a panpsychist direction. So, like when it comes to like when we observe a distant star, um, there is certainly a sense, I think, in which that moment of experience itself is a decision and thus a collapsing on our part. But at the same time, I think that, even if you detonated the entire Earth tomorrow, those distant stars are experiencing their own existence, because really any kind of self-generative systems have that kind of experiential component. Now, it could be a kind of matter of degree, though, right? Where with something like a star system, or even just an atom or something like that, there's this kind of fuzziness that needs that intensification of human consciousness for whatever reason in order to like become fully concrete in the way that we experience the corporeal world. um Maybe I'm not sure about that. I think it does feel to me like it's more parsimonious just to say that the collapsing does happen in a complete kind of way within any occasion of experience, regardless of whether it's human or not. But maybe there's a good reason for thinking otherwise. I'm not entirely sure.
Hmm.
Um, but when you talked about like a beyond the horizon of our visible universe, is that stuff there? If so, then where is that information? Um, I would suppose that it's in the same space within which the past is. This kind of idea of like an Akashic record, as it were, is what Whitehead calls the consequent nature of God, the kind of bodily dimension of the divine, which in a way serves as a kind of cosmic memory. And within Whitehead system, that's a completely necessary component, because that's what allows the past to feed into the future at all. So there would be no function of the past. There would be no
Hmm.
defining of the past were it not for that activity of the consequent nature of God.
I would
Because what
think,
makes Go ahead.
sorry, I would think that like we can mutually substantiate that Akashic record in the same way that like you have a village, one person may have a spotty recollection of events, but you get all of the various narratives of what's happened, you get a pretty full account of the goings on of the village. So the cosmos, being causally connected, is able to mutually define its past states because there is that causal contact, because we're communicating. There's a real connection, a causal connection. So when you deal with causally disconnected regions, I would think that memory system no longer functions. Like you would have to posit the Akashic record as basically a non-local universal field, which you could, but it would be characterized by infinitely much information. And then does that infinite non-local field grow over time? How
If the universe is infinite,
right.
um, which, yeah, it depends. There's a lot of variables here. If the universe is infinite, then yeah, the Akashic record would have to be infinite. But then that Akashic record, if that is a dimension of God, then that doesn't seem like something we can write off either. The non-locality of it, that's a whole other thing, because that does directly contradict Einsteinian physics. So that is something worth taking into consideration. Um, Frankly, I'm just usually willing to bite the bullet on this and just say that Einstein was wrong. But how he was wrong is something that I don't think is entirely clear. Um, we could point to quantum entanglement, for example, but then that raises the question of whether quantum entanglement really allows for information transfer, or then you got questions about how you define information and whatnot. So there's a lot of different considerations to take in, and a lot of things we don't know. Personally, I am very skeptical of the possibility of an actual infinity, which is not to say that I believe it that you can't have an actual infinity. You definitely have real transcendental objects that involve infinities and infinitesimals. So, for example, like imaginary numbers, or even just pi, for example, is a more
Mm-hmm.
mundane example of this. But then, can you have, for example, like an infinite number of apples? Like, can you treat infinity like an actual quantity of
Mm-hmm.
things in the real world? Can you? So does that mean that you can have infinite space? Um, or is thinking about space in terms of numbers of things the wrong way of thinking about it? Can you have an infinite number of stars? Does it logically make sense to think of that possibility? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it does, and I'm not sure that it doesn't. We could be in an infinite universe. It seems easier for me to imagine a temporally infinite universe, like if it's just kind of like spiraling over and over again. That
Mm-hmm.
seems to make more sense to me, because it just simply because I that seems more natural than the idea that it just has a definite starting point and then it just ends and then that's it. You know what I mean? It
Mm-hmm.
makes more sense that there would be something cyclical going on, and if there's something cyclical going on, then you would expect that to be infinite, I would think. But
But
then
then
how?
also, in that case, wouldn't that eliminate the real distinction between the past and future? Because any possible state will have occurred at some point if time has been already occurring infinitely long.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could be, just like, to give a kind of like very oversimplified example, it could be that you've got like 12 possible iterations of the universe and you just go through all 12 of those over and over again, right? Like,
Right.
of course it would be more than that, presumably, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all possibility. It also doesn't necessarily have to be the case that all of those different loops are available to one another. So, for example, like the universe plays through its full epochal cycle once and then it starts over. But then when it does that, that first cycle is what happened there is not available to what happens in the second one.
Okay, maybe it doesn't access all possibilities or actualize all possibilities, but it would kind of render everything deterministic because whatever the laws ordained for one of those 12 universes that's possible, all those
Mm-hmm.
laws are going to be totally exhausted in one infinite cycle, right?
Right. And so, yeah, I don't know. Hmm. So if it was like, yeah, if it was a small number, like or any finite number like that, even if it was like just a astronomically large number, once you go through it once, then you're just going to go through the same thing over and over again, right? So that does make it look more deterministic. That does kind of seem to negate the significance of agency and creative freedom in all this. So then what's the alternative? Well, an alternative is that the possibility space really is infinite, and that it can just spiral forever without repeating.
Hmm.
In which case, then it would at least look like the freedom that we have isn't illusory, because no matter what universe we find ourselves in, we're still blazing uncharted territory, as it were.
Right.
But then
Leibniz.
we're talking about infinity, which means that any universe we find ourselves in, you've got an infinitely long past behind you, which means that you should be able to find your exact decisions somewhere in that past if it's actually infinite, right?
Right. Yes.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Leibniz makes the same caveat when he's discussing the idea that the universe shouldn't just be the best possible universe, but it should be the greatest possible universe, the greatest in extent. Because if it's good, but it's only like one guy who lives on an island, it's, maybe good for that guy, but it's not as great as it possibly could be. So Leibniz says that this is why in the monadology he discusses, if you zoom in on a cell on an animal and keep zooming in, you're going to find stars and planets and rivers and streams and other life forms ad infinitum, but without repeat, which
mm,
is a very interesting concept. It's sort of what you were saying with time. Like, can we imagine a cycling universe that's always fresh, that never repeats anything? And I think that you can't. I think it's too hard to do that, even for like Leibniz. Doing it with the spatial example, like the same basic problem comes up. We have the set of, since we're basically finite, as far as like we can tell, assuming we're finite, there's a finite causal set that we're actually connected to, that is kind of our extended memory, our extended mind to an extent. It informs us as a subject. Beyond that, do you want to say that all of this infinite specified complexity is already there? If you say that, then you have to explain the relations we have to an infinite number of points, and that's obviously an infinite amount of information, and you need some kind of Akashic record to keep track of that. Uh, I guess, and it would have to have weird properties, like it already contains an infinite number amount of information, but somehow generates new information going forward. It's sort of like the problem, like, if God is omniscient, can God learn anything? It seems like he couldn't, because he already knows everything. There's no new experience for him to have. And it would be like that for an Akashic record, where there's that infinite universe in spatial terms. It already knows everything that's possible because it's the greatest possible universe. You would need a combination of the greatest possible universe, where it's always fresh, everything is unique, and a system of time where nothing ever repeats, and where each finite system, the relations it has to all other finite systems, are fully specified and stored somewhere. The alternative, which I think is actually simpler, is saying that beyond that causal set, beyond where we're actually interacting with, it's always quantum information rather than classical information. It is that real probability space, past, future, and the where we are in that is anthropic. It's just like the way in which the forms instantiate in the world, right? The triangle is up there, the eternal triangle, and it's able to instantiate in a variety of different contexts. Our identity, as we experience it right now, would be analogous to a form that can instantiate in a variety of contexts. So that's kind of my like central theme in my own philosophical speculations. Like,
so it starts to look like our entire universe is basically a transcendental object that's being actualized.
right, and it exists relative to that matter potential background, and that allows a continual openness to transformations of that state, and then this giant world soul transcendental object can cycle through and explore all of its possibilities without the hassle of, at the same time, fully specifying all possible relations it has to all of it. No, there is no actual infinity. There is, this finite thing, and it's infinite instantiations. It's
I think I'm
accessible.
inclined to agree with you. This is what I was saying before we even started this part of the conversation. I was like, "Oh, here we go." Infinity gets so weird so quickly. um,
It's a fun one though.
yeah, it is. It is for sure. But yeah, I guess the probably the easiest way to look at it, I think, would be to say that if you have maybe not an infinite, but let's say an indefinite, I mean, that's a little more careful number of iterations of the universe, which would mean that we are at a certain specific number of iterations into the process, which means there's not an infinite number of universes behind us. There is a finite number of them. An infinite number could be in the future, but those are possible universes. So it'll never actually get to infinity.
Hmm.
It'll be asymptotically approaching that, I guess, is the way you would put it. But then I think at that point you could look at it like, all right, well, we are actually kind of moving into novel territory within the universe that we're actually actualizing right now, um, without it necessarily being a repetition of something that has happened before. But at the same time, if you're looking at just the anachronon itself, the world of forms at large, then yes, it would be the case that any possible universe, including this actual one, including the specifications of this very conversation, are in there somewhere, and we are in some sense just kind of selecting them and pulling them down into this kind of experiential intensification.
Yeah. No, that's basically how I think of it.
Mhm.
So often, like the theological metaphor is the easiest, especially when you, personify God and make him uh, choose things the way we choose things. Do you
Mhm.
think that that kind of God mind exists in the first place? I guess let's get that out of the way. Like the omniscient, omnipotent, like basically the what the all of the possible omega points are pointing to, like the supreme being, essentially. Is there one?
Yeah, so I think the way Whitehead describes this is very useful. So you have a Trinitarian kind of God with Whitehead. You have the what he just calls creativity, which I kind of identify with this idea of like the ultimate teleological attractor, this idea of numinosity or beauty or intensification that's kind of driving the whole thing, and that then kind of corresponds to Christ, right? That's the logos, really. Then you have what he calls the primordial nature of God, which would, I think, correspond to like the idea of the Father God, and that is pure conceptual awareness, which is to say the feeling, the conscious feeling of the anachronon itself, all of the forms basically, and so all of that is kind of contained within the primordial nature of God, which then performs this kind of evaluative function, kind of steering the ship, as it were, through that infinite possibility space. And then that kind of filters down so as to give rise to the what he calls the consequent nature of God, which is really the natural world, the Akashic record, the corporeal, the actual, and the memory within that. And so that's kind of more of like a pantheistic Spinoza-esque kind of God equals nature kind of thing, but it's all kind of in there. You could say that's kind of equivalent to like the Holy Spirit or something like that. And so yeah, you kind of tie all those things together, and you get basically what you would derive from Christian theology. I think there is omnipotence in the sense that anything that is possible is going to be actualized through that creative power. There is uh, omniscience in the sense that everything that has happened or could happen is also kind of in some way or another present within that super consciousness, and omnibenevolent in the sense that that activity is always guided by that Christ, that logos, that ultimate teleological. What does Chris Longan call it? Telon.
Telor, yeah.
Yeah, teller. Yeah. Well, tellers are the organisms, the beings that.
Oh, you mean like the supreme one? Yeah. I forget.
Well, no, teller is his term for like what Whitehead calls an actual entity. So like an
Right.
organism for Longan is a tellor, and then a telon is like a goal. It's like the goal of the teleological activity of the tellor.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't read the CTMU in a little while. Good to revisit. I have a friend
Yeah.
who's doing a reading group on that at the
Oh,
moment.
nice.
But so on this idea of omniscience, related to the previous conversation, I mean, do you believe there is a being with omniscience? Because it seems like the implication of that would be, in a sense, there is no real novelty because all of it's already pre-contained in the divine omniscience,
I think
right?
it depends on how you conceptualize it. I would say that even God does not know in advance necessarily what specific decisions we are going to make at any given time, because there is that creative freedom there, which I think is inextricably indeterminate in some ways. So, insofar as I am navigating various layers of possibility space right now and having this conversation, um, all of those possibilities are going to be available within the mind of God, but God's not going to be able to necessarily predict in advance which ones I am going to choose. Now, you could say that that's not really omniscience. I mean, I'll let other people split hairs over that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. That's not something I'm going to get too hung up over. But I think in the more significant, more important sense of omniscient, in the sense that the anachronon, the Platonic heaven, is available there as a totality within the primordial nature of God. That is the more important sense of omniscience, I think.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I think that, again, it's a little bit neater to go with something like Molinism, where God knows and creates all possibility. It's all actual for him and for the beings that are in each particular place in that actuality. And we, because we're finite in this infinite system, really exist in a kind of superposition of the possible directions we might go. So for us, the freedom is real because it's simply not defined what our connection is to other moments. But for God, the whole thing is known because he knows all actual occasions, he knows all possibilities fully, and so actualizes them at the same time. So,
I see what you're saying. I see that you're saying there's like a frame shift here where what looks like freedom to us could look determined from God's perspective. Yeah, I see. The thing is, from as I see it, there's still got to be some sense in which our creative decision making, our creative life activity is collapsing indeterminacies into determinacies. Though now it could be that all of those possibilities are kind of equally present within the kind of primordial consciousness of God. But then I would still want to say, well, you've still got an actual past. You've still got an actual lineage of things that actually did collapse down into determinate events, actual decisions that
mm-hmm.
actually were made, at least from our perspective. And presumably that distinction between what is actualized and what could have been would also be present for God. So Whitehead really just kind of bites the bullet on this. He says that there's a sense in which we are shaping the consciousness of God in as much as God is shaping our consciousness through shaping the world. And so it's a kind of back and forth thing for him. And that works for me. I think some people would have a problem with that,
Do you
but
think God exists in time then?
partially. The primordial nature doesn't, because it's the cognition, apprehension of form is itself atemporal. So the
Mm-hmm.
primordial nature exists outside of time, but the consequent nature is time. So, and those are the two sides of the God coin, as it were. There's really three, because then you have the Christ thing, the logos as well, but either way.
Mm, interesting. In Neoplatonism, we'll have like many different emanations that kind of degrade from the demiurge all the way down to the world soul, and then from the world soul all the way down to our individual souls and particular events in the material cosmos. I like, the idea of these intermediaries. I kind of like the Neoplatonic idea that on any spectrum, there's always going to be a new midpoint, in the sense that the number of spirits intermediate between me and the world soul may well be infinite, but they're not specified. They're not like brought into my causal set, um, you know, macro kind of monad system until I measure them. And that active measurement, again, going back to Henry Staff's concept of what's going on with quantum mechanics, our active measurement is at the same time creating for us that real distinction of which entities we're in contact with. So, with the Trinitarian God you're describing, the fear is that you're creating a determinate entity that is in time, that has certain characteristics, that seemingly is like it's too hemmed in. Like that's the way that objects act when we measure them. Whereas the way divinity would have to be in itself, himself, would have to transcend that kind of, like, to say that God right now exists on a Sunday seems strange. Like God
Mhm.
surely like encompasses all the days in all of his aspects. Um, like, could there be intermediaries between us and God that are vehicles for God that
Yeah,
themselves
so
are temporally bounded? Sure, but
let's back up for just a second. So about the idea of there being layers, yeah, completely agree with that, because that as I see it is exactly what this kind of akashic record slash consequent nature of God, whatever you want to call it, cosmic memory is doing, right? So you have the realm of necessity, right? But then you also have like habits, and then you have things that happened in the past that can be made available in the present. And that, in a way, is kind of like this intermediary spiritual realm of kind of like a space of possibilities that's not just like pure form, but it's like form that is like sculpted by that which has already happened, right?
mhm.
And so the consequent nature of God facilitates that. Now, about what you were saying about God existing right now on a Sunday. Yeah, so with regards to the kind of primordial consciousness of God, or for Christ, logos. Yeah, that doesn't really make any sense. Like, yeah, it's present now, but to say that it is presently existing, right? Like that does kind of feel like weird and wrong somehow. But with the consequent nature of God, that's really the temporal aspect of God's existence. And that is not, I wouldn't say it exists in time. It is time, because it is the totality of that which has been actualized, and the kind of mediating function that allows that past actuality to be inherited and to contribute itself into the continually unfolding of the cosmos. So without that, there would be no time. There would be no universe. You would just have possibilities, because it's that function which is important for facilitating that interaction between potentiality and actuality.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that basically accords with the role of the world soul, which is where time
Yeah.
comes from in Platonism. Uh, I'll like throw out one more thought in this vein, and then I want to
Yeah.
explore some consequences of morphic resonance, and I could also throw out like my explanation from some of the principles we've talked about of morphic resonance, but it's going to be technical and maybe a little bit boring. So let's just go for like the interesting consequences of the theory. But
Okay.
this last point on this subject, so an idea is that the world soul energizes temporally in an eternal perpetuity. Other souls may have a shorter kind of wavelength, right? So the length of time that the world soul measures is infinite perpetuity. In like, different, actually, Whitehead in the concept of nature talks about a concept similar to this, where like when we're taking account of time, we're grabbing like multiple slices of time in an integral and accounting for that as a kind of moment, right? And different organisms, I would expect, would have different like scales of a present moment. We would
Mhm.
have a different wavelength of how we measure time.
So
And
Bergson, he calls this duration, but
right,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, so there would have to be like the mind soul that is capable of the greatest duration. So that would be something like the world soul that measures time all together at once in one like all comprehending, yeah,
Yeah.
temporalizing act. But then, and that would be also at the same time like the all of the cosmoses, or maybe the one cosmos attached to the world soul, the absolute peak soul, would be like the best of all possible worlds, the absolute best of all possible worlds, like what Leibniz kind of promises this is, but it seems very like dubious given what we see happening in the world. And then from there, we have shadows of the world soul. We have emanations from the world soul until we get down to like the world soul that governs our world. And it doesn't measure perpetuity, it measures like a 20 billion year time frame, and then it has to reset or something. Or it's like that Platonic account in the Statesman where God intervenes, our world soul, representative of like our series of the demiurge, which is probably not the ideal one, but it's like the one that we have because it's the one we deserve. That uh, comes in, orders things, reduces entropy, gathers in to a unity. That I'm kind of like, thinking of it in modern physics terms. Plato says that like there is a golden age, the good demiurge, the Cronian demiurge, organizes things. We're basically immortal during that time, but he can't constantly micromanage the cosmos at all times, so he walks away and does other things, and then the cosmos degrades and entropy sets in, we start dying, and conflicts happen. And so that's that cycle is for all inferior worlds, perhaps the world soul measures these finite spans of time, and we have to cycle through imperfection, moving towards perfection, something like that. Where like I'm not sold on the idea that like our time is it. It does seem inferior in some ways, so I don't want to like taint God with the nature of our particular cosmos, because I feel like we haven't done the best of all possible jobs at organizing our own cosmos, and so I'd rather say like, well, we have something that's in the image of God, maybe, that governs our time, that maintains our akashic record, but it's not going to be the ideal one. So if you have any thoughts on that concept, and then maybe we can look at morphic resonance again.
Yeah, that idea. If I'm gathering what you're saying correctly, it's almost like the idea that you've got kind of like a nested hierarchy of anima mundis or something like that, and like the
Mm.
bottom layer is like the demiurge or something. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But I think ultimately, if we're talking about the imperfection of the world, see, I always look at this from the perspective of like art and music. Like you could have a like ultimate perfectly detailed symmetrical work of art, and then it'd be like, oh well, we did it, we did art is over now, congratulations. But like, we wouldn't feel like that was actually like the end of art, you know what I mean? Because the idea of art itself necessitates this idea of freedom and expression and creative adventurousness, right? That allows it to be not just the instantiation of a possible ideal, but, well, I mean, it is the instantiation of a possible ideal, but part of that idealicness is the idea that it is discovered, that it is felt out, that we do, forget within the river Lethe and feel our way forward through a tumultuous cosmos full of things like pain and suffering and stupid mistakes and
Mm.
cringy things you did in high school that you wish you could forget about, and so on and so forth. That's all kind of part of the game, I think. Um, and yes, it's definitely not a perfect mirroring of some idyllic ultimate harmony. But at the same time, I think we could say that it does seem to be, as Chardin says, and as I have suggested, it is spiraling towards that. Now, then that does kind of raise some questions like, what if does it just spiral forever? Do we ever actually achieve a definite end goal or not? Chardin seems to think that we do. I'm very skeptical
Yeah.
of that.
And
I
then the universe is just over. It's like that perfect work of art. Like,
Right. It
what
feels
now?
to me more like the Whitehead makes a lot of use of this idea of like an asymptotic approach. Like it gets closer and closer and closer and closer forever and ever and ever, but it never actually touches that kind of feels to me more like what's going on here. So in any case, yeah, let's morphic resonance. What were we gonna talk about with regards to that?
Yeah, so I agree with the evidence that Sheldrake presents. Anecdotally, I also feel that when in my communities a topic is explored in depth and many people understand it well, then I find it easier to understand. Not just because I've watched YouTube videos of people explaining the same concept, but it seems as though like we are somehow processing information as collectives in a way
Mm-hmm.
that goes beyond just the information that we're obviously sharing. So I don't know, maybe you could explain first for those who aren't familiar some of the phenomenology, some of the evidence that this is a real phenomenon. There's a lot of it, and you've gone over a lot in your videos, but yeah, from there, and then this idea of like collectively processing information. What are the implications of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I should probably begin by just kind of sketching out the basic idea for those who haven't seen my work or Sheldrake's work. That the general gist came from Sheldrake's research he did initially in India, where he was studying plant embryology, plant morphogenesis. And what he found is that the mechanistic explanations, attempts at explanations for how the differentiation of different kinds of plants actually occurs were not adequate. So there were these different explanations with things like proteins, for example. And what he would find is that, well, yes, that protein seems to play a role in how this plant shapes itself in a certain way, but it does the exact same thing in this other plant, and this other plant turns into something completely different. So there's something we're missing here. And so just kind of following that down, he ends up coming up with this idea of morphic resonance, the idea that a living system is able to draw from a kind of formative toolbox, as it were, of the pathways, the formative pathways taken by similar systems in the past, right? Um, so, for example, if you've got like some kind of pea plant that's different than pea plant B, it's not just a matter of DNA. It's not just a matter of the different protein structures or whatever. Those are actually, in some sense, secondary. What's more fundamental is the memory, the fact that pea plant A is part of a lineage of certain decisions, developmental decisions that were made by that lineage of organisms that any given pea plant A is going to be drawing from, right? And then pea plant B is going to have a different lineage. It's going to be drawing from a different lineage of decisions. So the formative space available to it is going to be different than that of the first example, right? And so at first, it doesn't seem like a terribly radical idea, but as you start kind of picking apart the implications of that, it gets very wild very quickly. Because if that kind of thing is happening within the physiological development of living beings, then that could also be something which occurs with the mental processes, the psychical processes of human beings, like what you were suggesting with the fact that if you have a group of people, a kind of mini zeitgeist can happen where people start having the same ideas at the same time. And there seems to be this kind of spooky synchronization which occurs. And Sheldrake has produced evidence of this. He's performed experiments and even beyond his own work. I mean, there's for well over 100 years now, there is an extensive body of evidence for non-local synchronization between psychological processes. I mean, you talk about like the Gansfeld experiments and whatnot. I mean, there's an enormous body of evidence there for anyone who's actually willing to look at it. Yeah, a lot of what I've been doing is kind of connecting those ideas that Sheldrake developed with what I see going on in the more metaphysical works of Bergson and Whitehead, because I think all of the implications of Sheldrake's scientific ideas are there metaphysically in Whitehead and Bergson, and really even before them. You can find examples of this in the German idealists as well, I think, but
Yeah. Well,
nonetheless,
Schopenhauer explicitly says that like forms have a will to repeat themselves.
yeah.
So, yeah, crystal under Schopenhauer's theory, crystal formation, like once that shape is actualized, the will like becomes something, claims an identity, it's going to like facilitate its own expansion, which is one frame of reference there. Um, I think I'll go ahead and throw out like what I think is happening with morphic resonance. It's not too hard because we already went over like the theoretical foundations of it. But basically, like our identity contains our past in the sense that our causal set embeds a memory structure that specifies a limited range of pasts. And part of that, of course, will be like the particular structures that things have. Now we find ourselves in a universe where, say, a particular like protein folds in manner X, and that protein, given some combination of DNA, amino acids, I think is what I was looking for, it folds in a particular way for us in general. That doesn't mean that it's deterministic, that that's the only way that it can fold, but statistically, because we exist in a universe characterized by this particular manner of folding, it becomes more likely that we will find ourselves in a universe also characterized by that same feature. It's a principle in statistics. I don't know if there's a name for this, but like when you go to the bank, you're more likely to go to the bank when it's crowded than when it's not crowded. That's because you're going to find yourself in a set of 10 people who are all at the bank at the same time more often than you'll find yourself in a set of just one person in there by themselves. You're more likely to find yourself in a crowd of like kind, right? Like maybe there's a couple people on the International Space Station, but statistically, if you're going to find yourself somewhere either on the ISS or on Earth, you're going to find yourself on Earth because that's where humans are clustered. So similarly, patterns in general will be clustered in like the multiverse. So I think we're kind of like defining the timeline that we belong to as we go. There is a kind of open future in the sense that many different like somewhat deterministic processes, like the different ways that a protein can fold, are available. But once it's defined, then we narrow the future as well as like narrowing the past. So we narrow that down. I think it amounts to the same phenomenology, but it's not that. I mean, it's basically just the difference that we've been talking about. Is the future totally open and none of it's already there, or are all of the timelines there and we simply select from them? So since I go for we select from them, I say that kind of anthropically, based on what we are observing now, we narrow down our future to timelines that are consistent with it statistically. So that's my explanation for it. But I think it has very profound implications for like politics, and I don't necessarily want to go straight for the most controversial implications of it, but like Sheldrake himself, became an Anglican because he's English, and he realized that in practicing his faith, he better like be in accordance with the resonant field of those who share his same shape. And of course it's beyond just morphology and your particular phenotype. I think it's this same idea that I mentioned, like if you're characterized by property X, whether that's a relation or like a supposedly intrinsic property, you're going to find yourself resonating, amplifying with things that share that same characteristic. So cultures embody so many characteristics that are beyond just morphology. So I don't want to say it's all up to like Sheldrake is biologically English, therefore he should be Anglican to like maximize his resonance points or whatever. It's rather like he is part of this huge heritage, and all of this information is stored in institutions around him and other people around him, and that's going to shape what he is. And given that complex shape, it's like you have to move in accordance with that general like resonating structure to move optimally, which would imply a kind of traditionalism. It seems like Sheldrake affirms a kind of traditionalism on the basis of morphic resonance. So, what do you think about that?
So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That whenever we are participating in really anything, as especially things like ritualistic behaviors, religious practices, and so forth, there is going to be this calling upon the past, calling upon that memory in some kind of way. And the way that that feeds into us and the way that we contribute to it is going to have a lot to do with our own ancestry, for example, or like our cultural traditions, things like that. But I mean, it's also worth keeping in mind. There's a lot of malleability here. I mean, Sheldrake's ideas himself, he developed by spending many years in India, immersing himself in Indian culture, learning those traditions and whatnot, hanging out with yogis and things like that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Sheldrake's completely right to feel a kind of how should I say this? A kind of affinity or loyalty, let's say, to that kind of Anglican tradition, even though his beliefs, I think, would probably be considered heterodox in many ways from kind of standard Anglican theology. But nonetheless, he participates because he understands the importance of that participation, and I think that's totally a good thing. That's something that more people should do. I wish I had more of that in my life, but unfortunately, I feel very little affinity with the kind of Southern Baptist Bible Belty kind of religiosity. So I'm kind of just out here on my own, a fish in the sea, as it were. But nonetheless, I do see the importance of that, and definitely the importance of any kind of practices which bring people together, because when you do bring people together, you are generating those kinds of relationships of synchronization and resonance and whatnot. And I think there's a lot of different ways that this can be done,
Mm-hmm.
which might come to more of our disagreements on this issue. I don't want to get too polemical about it here at the very end. We've already been talking for a couple hours, but nonetheless, no. I mean, as far as the kind of traditionalist bent towards that kind of thing, um, yeah, I completely agree. Insofar as we're talking about the importance of practices and the importance of community and building those kind of structures and reinforcing them and whatnot. Um, as for your way of explaining the morphic resonance phenomenon, that's something I would have to think about a little bit. I think the way that you're talking about this in terms of statistics and possible universes, I see kind of like the thread of logic that you're pulling through that, and it's interesting to me. It is a bit different than the explanation I have given, which is, of course, much more heavily drawing upon the latter stages of Whitehead's metaphysics, where he begins to talk about these ideas of like hybrid prehension and whatnot, and the way that these kind of formative experiences kind of overlap with one another within a kind of possibility space, or a morphological space, we could say, rather than in terms of physical space.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the way I think about it is definitely a bit different than that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an incongruity there. I could probably see how we could maybe thread those together in some kind of way, but again, I kind of have to think about it, I believe.
Yeah, no, it all comes down to the philosophy of time. As far as I can tell, I don't necessarily disagree with Whitehead's account, except insofar as he would say that we can generate like absolutely new forms. I think the forms always have to be there. It seems like Whitehead believes that we can effectively create new, I forget his terminology for it, eternal objects, right? Like,
Eternal objects. Well, I mean, the name eternal object implies these are not created. They are pure transcendentals. But then what happens within this creative advance is that eternal objects come together to form complex eternal objects,
Hmm.
and that would be more akin to like these kind of morphological phase spaces and whatnot.
Right.
It's not just a form; it's a complex relationship of possible forms, and that's what's kind of created over time.
Yes, and so I would say like that's like the spermaticos logos in the mind, or like the seminal reason principles of nature, which do evolve in the mind of our world soul. I would say probably our world soul is not like the number one world soul. I think we're probably in a somewhat inferior world, not the best of all possible, but it still redounds to the greater good because we're experiencing stuff here, like perfect imperfections that are cool and stuff. Um, so back to the like morphic resonance and identity issue, it seems like there's a very clear implication that the way that you think, your actions, uh, your ontogeny and development will have an effect more on not just people who share your similar cultural practices, but maybe more fundamentally people who share your phenotype and genotype. Like, wouldn't this be like for the
I wouldn't even
racialists
deny
out
that
there?
that's the
Wouldn't they
case. I
like
mean, I
love
wouldn't
to use
argue with
this?
you there. I wouldn't argue with you there necessarily, but I think maybe the disagreement here is that you're much more, from what I've seen, inclined towards looking at the kind of homogeneity of the past as a positive thing, and that the kind of heterogeneity and pluralism of the current state of affairs as necessarily a bad thing. And I can see why you would see that. I mean, if you look at like cities, modern cities, for example, I mean, it's just a complete nightmare because of the disintegration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we can talk about things like mass immigration as well as having this very degenerative effect upon a national identity or cultural cohesion and whatnot. I'm not going to argue against any of those things. But I also think that the way that I look at things here is much more future oriented in some ways and much more colored by Chardin's ideas. So Chardin talks about, for example, that the sphericality of the Earth is very significant as we move forward into the coming epochs with the development of the noosphere and whatnot, because that sphericality necessitates that as humanity kind of spreads out across the globe, it inevitably comes to encounter itself and kind of blend in some ways. Now, I'm not going to idealize some kind of like neoliberal notion of like a post ethnic, post racial society. That's not my shtick. That's not what I'm into. But nonetheless, I think that we're in a phase of history right now where we have to look at the breakdowns that are happening, not just as a negative, degenerative thing that we need to run away from, but we also need to look at them as a kind of clearing away for new possibilities. And so the significance here really for me is the what I see is as the teleological implications for human history of the Logos, specifically of the Christ event. Now, the ultimate uncashed check of Christianity, as I see it, is the idea of a life world, a human community, which is woven together through mutual orientation towards that logos, so
Mm-hmm.
towards that ultimate teleological attractor, because that then really transforms human beings, and allows for potentially the possibility of a very different kind of life world, very different kinds of life, human life activity. Now, if we contrast that with the two primary modes of human social cohesion, which have existed throughout really all of human history, even after, I would say, the Christ event, as it were, you got two primary things. You've got in the East, you have primarily conformity and homogeneity based societies, right? And so the Chinese, for example, as they built their empire, their whole shtick was that they would very aggressively kind of convert other peoples to Han Chinese culture, because within the Eastern way of thinking about things, it is that cultural conformity which is paramount. There's not really much of a distinction between morality as such and morality understood as social conformity. Being good means doing what is socially expected of you, period. Here in the West, we think of things very differently. It's not very difficult at all for us to imagine that the group can just be wrong and the individual can just be right sometimes. I mean, we see this in all of our novels and movies, and in just the way that we think about our relationship to the world, especially when we're really beginning our individuation as young adults and whatnot. But nonetheless, you don't quite have that same emphasis on homogeneity in the West. And the substitute for that, really, if we look at the Roman Empire, for example, the Romans didn't care what different peoples. They were not interested in converting everyone into becoming Romans. At least, well, they tried that a little bit near the end and it didn't work. But for the most part, they didn't care about that. They were like, I don't care what gods you worship. You're going to pay your taxes or we're going to kill you. That was their whole thing. So it was a violence based social cohesion rather than a conformity based social cohesion. As I see it, the ultimate implication, that uncashed check, which I mentioned for the Christ event, is the possibility of really a love-based social cohesion in which it's not necessarily about conformity or homogeneity or coercive power, whether that's violence or financial coercion. And I think that if we look at the breakdowns that are happening right now with regards to our cultures, as tragic as some of them may seem, we can see this as laying a groundwork for the necessitation of that eventual realization. Because then if you've got that kind of breakdown, you don't have that kind of social cohesion anymore in terms of homogeneity and conformity, then you have to look to other ways of achieving that, right? And so that kind of ends up creating that kind of lure for that Christ impulse, as it were, to come in and ultimately give rise to a new kind of human life world.
Mm. Yeah, very interesting. I could see the Roman power structure as being violence based, or maybe we could call it timocratic. There is like an excellence of virtue that allows martial dominance that involves the other virtues. Like, you can't just be warlike and not be wise in some respects. You have to obviously be courageous. You have to like exemplify some virtue to succeed in war. So I think other nationalities did recognize that the Romans had excelled in virtue, and that's part of why they allowed themselves to be submissive for so long, and eventually they did kind of assimilate to the Roman identity. So what you're talking about is like not so much like an antithesis to that as like that, but we're going to move from timocratic virtue to the true aristocratic virtue, philosophical, like, love of logos and all of that. And I'm definitely on board for it. But the idea that like the destruction of existing types creates this kind of new prime matter from which the new humanity springs, I'm not as drawn towards, because I think that Christ as like the efficient creative agency of the absolute will have, created these national identities for a reason. And I think anthropologically speaking, it's not like the types that exist now are not happenstance, and they haven't like come into being recently. What the differences by and large that we see between different groups today have to do with which ancestral, even more homogenous groups they are mixes of. Like, all Europeans are descended from early European farmers who migrated from Anatolia, the steppe nomads, Indo-European speakers, and the Western hunter-gatherers who had basically been in Europe for tens of thousands of years. And European ethnicities vary in these different ways, but like go back 10,000, 20,000 years, and things, as far as we can tell from the genetic evidence, it was like, you know, stark demographic contrasts from one region to another. And there would be like very definite boundaries before one between one zone and another, different technologies, and that makes sense with morphic resonance. You know, just like all of the natural world, it seems like, you know, there's effort to find a way to negotiate an environment and succeed in it, and we help each other to learn this way of being in this place, and that grows into a kind of superorganism. And it started from that kind of low entropy state where there were stable, like demographic entities that occupied space, that thought together, that learned how to be in the world together. And now those have mixed in various ways to define like new, smaller types where you have a ton of countries in Europe with their own languages and everything, but sharing that broader background. I think like, you know, that's not accidental. That was part of the way things had to go. And if the like heritage types were all just blended out completely and we didn't have any coherence there, uh, I mean, maybe there's some like teleological justification for why we go through this, like low
Yeah,
entropy,
I
high
definitely don't think
entropy.
we're gonna get to like a like complete homogenization. No, absolutely not. But
Okay.
um, I think we're really talking about a difference in emphasis here
Mm-hmm.
because, as I see it, again, looking back to that sphericality and that necessitating of um, overlapping and encountering that Chardin calls attention to. Or again, gesturing back to the fact that Sheldrake's ideas came directly from the influence that he derived from Indian culture. Um, and really, we can broaden the scope even further. I think that if we really zoom out and look at the particular historical epoch we're in right now, that the development of the new forms that are needed must be done through kind of intercultural dialogue. And I do think that does necessitate a greater heterogeneity in some ways with regards to particular nations and whatnot. There's because there is going to be more bleeding at the edges at the war, as it were. And I don't think there's any way to stop that. Even if we tore down neoliberalism tomorrow, you would still have that, I think. But again, that's not the same as every sense of particular human identity just being
Mm-hmm.
blended together into one gray meaningless soup. But yeah, it is a difference in emphasis, I think, because I think that I don't necessarily see that interpenetrating of these different forms of identity as bad in itself, even though I do agree that we can see it as exacerbating problems which are really coming from that are being generated for other reasons, like due to the
Right.
nature of capitalism, due to the nature of uh, the way that globalism is facilitating these movements of mass migration and things like that.
Right. Michael Levin talks about how cells are able to group together to form multicellular organs or organisms. And part of it is the way these gap junctions, these connections between cells, allow the electric field between cells to homogenize. And he thinks that these electric fields are storing memories that the cells have. And so effectively, it's like a mind meld, is what he's a Star Trek nerd, so that's the analogy he uses. But
Mhm.
um, they can't differentiate any longer whose memory is whose, and so the
Mm.
sense of identity is blended together.
Right.
Well, you know, morphic resonance implies that our memories aren't purely individual. Maybe they're primarily of our own brain structure and our own personal life history, but the capacity for calling on past states which resonate with our current makeup, I think, does imply that like similar populations, culturally, ethnically, etc., will have a capacity for shared memory, and therefore like forming this broader superorganism more than heterogeneous populations. I do think mixes happen. You know, of course they do. Like we exist because different populations in the past mixed. But if you don't have like a process of organ generation, like okay, so
Yeah.
you disrupt this process, difference comes in, and people are like very aware. I'm not that guy, definitely not. We look different, etc. But then
Mhm.
eventually, things mix together, and a new culture forms. Well, now it has to define its own kind of walls, and like that's the outer, this is the inner, so that it can share memory, so that it can function as an organ, and then hopefully all of these various organs are able to come together in a broader kind of global organism. I would think that on the kind of biological analogy, that would be the way to go. And like you definitely don't want to allow these nascent organs of the world body, or the body of Christ, I guess, if you trust that like logos literally will be the guiding principle here. You don't want to allow them to have blurry boundaries. I mean, some of them, yeah, some, stem cells are going to be there that aren't yet fully differentiated. Maybe Americans, to some extent, our ethnogenesis, our definition of this is what America is, hasn't been
Right.
fully explored. And that's up for debate to some extent. But we've been going for quite a while,
Yeah.
and touched on a lot of really interesting things. I think there's more to explore with like the political ramifications of both Michael Levin's thought, which is really fascinating, and also morphic resonance. And I'd like to learn more about Whitehead. So yeah, this was very fun. I encourage everyone to check out Formscape's channel. Like seriously, I rarely recommend a channel as highly as I am recommending this channel. But yeah, maybe like in the future we could catch up again and talk about some of these themes again. Especially like, let me just point to a future conversation where we like examine, I guess, more soberly, slower, more carefully, like what is the real difference between an open future in the sense that Whitehead talks about it, where like it is real potential, and an open future where there are many actualities that we can go to. Because I've encountered many times like discussions will go for hours and ultimately kind of hinge on I'm a temporal A theorist or temporal B theorist or whatever. So the theory of time is like one of those elements of philosophy that's not given enough attention to. But yeah, I got some great thoughts from you today on that. Any last words for our audience?
Thanks for watching, guys. That was a very long conversation, very fun conversation. Yeah, we should absolutely do this again. Again, channel is Formscapes if y'all want to check that out. And yeah, I love talking with you, man.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks everybody for listening. Take care.